Продовжуємо роботу в українському
We continue our activity. Topic Museum Maidan, how the European practices will be implemented in Ukraine. Public report of staff of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity on the results of a study tour to museums in France, Belgium and the Netherlands. Our guests are Robert van Voren, Professor, Advocacy Manager, initiator of the project Preservation of Oral History Maidan, Yulia Popova, coordinator of the Heinrich Böll Foundation Ukraine, Anastasia Haidukevych, head of the Museum Issues Unit of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, a member of the initiative of Maidan Museum, Museum of Freedom, Ihor Poshyvailo, Director General of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, Chairman of the NGO Maidan Museum, Olha Savenok, head of the Education Department of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, Olha, a leading artist of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, Yulia, senior researcher at the Research Department of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, and Poshyvailo, senior researcher of the Scientific Publishing Department of the National Museum of the Revolution of Dignity. Dear speakers, welcome to the floor. Good morning, dear colleagues, participants, and everyone who is interested in this topic. We are happy to see such great interest. And at the beginning, I'd like to say some introductory words to explain about this trip and what was its purpose and how it is related to the idea of creating the museum and further plans we are intend to implement. As you know quite well, the idea of creating the Maidan Museum was born during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, and it grew into the an initiative group of Maidan Museum of Freedom, and it has been working successfully for 2 years and developed the first draft concept, which is the basis for us. Currently, we have switched to a more profound work, developing final concept of the Museum of the Revolution of Dignity and all its parts, the memorial part and the museum part, and the Home of Freedom, 3 necessary components. And now we're switching to the stage of physical implementation of this idea, this concept of the museum, to make it a task for the future competition, which will be announced shortly, as we hope. And during the next 2 years, we need to have a result in the form of a specific building, an area, and the implementation of this project. Given the tasks we face and that they are unique to Ukraine, because the project is large in itself and the purpose is rather large, and it's not simple task to work with a hot history which is not completed today. It's easier to analyze and generate expositions of museums about periods remote in history. We live in this period, but this is important to us nevertheless. And it's important to record this very moment, taking into account all unique challenges in front of us. We will need to get familiarized, we needed to get familiarized with the international experience, how the global museum community copes with such challenges to present complicated history in museums. This year, 2017, has been announced the year of a complicated history in museums, a dialogue on this topic. That's why the team of the Museum of Maidan not for the first time takes trips abroad and tries to get familiarized with the world experience. The first trip was to Poland with regard to the fact that starting from 2014, Poland was a sample of such an explosion of information. And of course, there are various experiences we'd like to get familiarized. And due to the Böll Foundation and due to the to other experts, this project was possible. And this is a component, one of the complicated elements to develop the concept, because it's provided us with a range of instruments. And we saw how they can be implemented in practice. We saw not only positive examples that need to be borrowed and adapted to our situation, but we also saw examples that don't match our situation. And this is a very useful experience as well, because capturing by the multimedia, the museum by the multimedia is not always useful. Living conversation with the witness of the events can speak more about the events rather than screens, touch screens, or interactive tools. There are very many interesting moments, and I hope that they be mentioned by my colleagues. And as an announcement, I'd like to emphasize that this is only the first step. This is a finding of our experience. We would like to share not only with our colleagues with the Museum of Maidan, but with the whole museum environment. So we want to make a cycle of publications based on the results of this trip. That would be so that we could have an opportunity to get more profound information about the problems met by the environment of Europe. We want to make a workshop, a practical workshop, and I hope that our Dutch colleagues will join us, and we will be able to discuss very practical issues. Apart from building expositions, we want to create temporary exhibitions. I hope that we will have a permanent exhibition of the Museum of Maidan, and we want to make this a summer school for museum experts to share experience we are getting, to familiarize a wide range of museum experts of Ukraine with our experience, with global experience. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to our partner, Robert van Voren, professor, initiator of the project, and the head of the initiative to preserve the Maidan Museum, and he will tell us how this project appeared and how it correlates with our current tasks.
Anastasia Haidukevych already said this visit to museums in northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands is for us only a first step. And it was not just a trip to, to visit 10 museums, to see how these museums have been developed, how they are dealing with complex issues of the past, but also to use this as a basis for discussions with directors and curators at these museums to understand their way of thinking and in which direction they think they are going to develop their musea, to learn from their mistakes and to also give them feedback as to what we were seeing in their musea and what we liked and what we didn't like. And at the same time to develop an ongoing interaction between museologists in this part of the world and the people that are working on the Maidan Museum. So this is, for us, very much an investment in the future. As Anastasia says, our idea is that after the summer there will be a workshop. Some of the Dutch counterparts will be coming here in order to work with Ukrainian museologists on further on conceptualizing and discussing the, the hot issues as to what do you do with a museum in a country where the history is so fresh and where actually a war is still going on, which is, the after effect of the fresh events. So a very complicated situation. And then later try to develop a continuous kind of interaction between the two sides, resulting in a summer course in which we hope not only Ukrainian museologists will participate, but also museologists from countries like Lithuania and Georgia, also countries that are dealing with a Soviet past, with very hot and difficult issues from the past, and like in the case of Georgia, also with a recent war with Russia, just like Ukraine. So You know, the visit was very intense. I can assure you that we really worked like Stakhanovci. I think for both sides it was very satisfactory, because for the Dutch it is quite a different thing to come here for a couple of days and to, you know, to have a couple of meetings and to look around, instead of going for 5 days in a row, visiting places and having this constant interaction. So I think as far as confidence building and collegiality building, this was a perfect enterprise. There's one other thing that I noticed, which I think is really very important. The Ukrainian delegation consists of 6 people, 6 individuals, all with a specific function with regards to the Maidan Museum. And I think the visit itself was very important in developing teamwork, team building exercise. Because, you know, I usually work here in Ukraine mainly in the field of mental health, psychiatry, and one of the things that for the past 25 years we've been trying to develop is multidisciplinary teamwork in psychiatry. Making sure that there is a horizontal interaction between the various professionals, all with an equal important role in developing mental health care. I think in the case of developing a museum, you have the same situation. Yes, you have a director, you have a leader of the team, but each member of the team has a very important role, a crucial role in developing the eventual end result. And I think the visit very much helped to build this team. And you know, for us it's very exciting to look at this and to see the potential that this group has and the possibility that we have to learn in, you know, in later stages from them. Thank you.
Дякую.
Thank you, Robert, and I would like for good positive words about our team and for your help, and I'd like to give the floor to Yulia Popova, representative and coordinator of the Böll Foundation in Ukraine. Ms. Yulia will share information that finally it's not the first museum project for the Böll Foundation, and it's not just a simple thing. Thank you, Anastasia. Several words about why the German Green Political Foundation supports such projects and why it sees these projects as important, extremely important for Ukraine. This trip was supported by the program to promote democracy, and one of the purposes is that development of political discourse as to the history of the 20th century and recent history, and to combat idealization of the history. And when we people came up with this idea, it seemed very reasonable to us, and also we pushed by our previous partners. Maybe you heard about the competition Terra Dignita that was very participatory, and as a result of it, it became clear that the main stakeholders and the relatives of the killed persons evidenced the fact that the society doesn't want things to be done in haste, without reflection. And I think that everyone would agree that the Maidan is a key point for the modern history of Ukraine. That's why it's very important what type of history will be told to ourselves and to future generations. And this history shouldn't be told in haste, and has to be very thoroughly balanced as to its tools. That's why it seems to me that this process is good, that as was mentioned by Robert and Anastasia, that it makes a process and a dialogue out of the museum creation, and we see it as the basis for democracy. As to such important events, there is a dialogue which involves all the stakeholders, all people touched upon by these events. That's why we wish you success, further success in the creation of this museum, and we hope that this creation will be a dialogue, will continue to be a dialogue rather than just a one-time implementation of the museum. And it seems to us that everything was very successful, and we hope for further cooperation. Thank you. And also I'd like to concentrate on this thing that the museum has to be a place for a dialogue, and this is the principal thing for this very museum, to make this museum not just a report of the executive authorities about a certain historical event, that was given money, and that they can do something else than to occupy themselves with politics. First of all, this is a museum which is needed by the civil society. It's ours, and it has to be made with engagement of the civil society organizations. And as Robert mentioned, the team consisted of staff members responsible for various trends of the museum development. The educational trend, Olha Savenok, designer trend, Olga Salo, and also an important item of scientific research, what really happened on the Maidan. I think that we don't have and won't have simple answers to this question, but it has to be studied, and this trend lies with Ukrainian safaris. And what tools should be used during the creation of the Maidan? Multimedia, video, photo, how to work with them. Bogdan Poshyvailo, a research fellow, is responsible for this trend, who professionally looked at all the presented expositions, and the most important is the general management, how the museum should be built and how it should communicate with the authorities, and what distance should be built, and how to communicate with the society, how to establish this communication, how to solve the task to have in one building, or maybe in one room or several rooms, to combine three absolutely different components of the museum, because it's the museum, there's a memorial, and also the research center. And to tell briefly about this moment again, I'm giving the floor to Ihor Poshyvailo. Please share with your impressions. First of all, I am thankful to the facilitators who provided us with such an opportunity to promulgate the work actively carried out in our museum. Of course, it's not our first trip, not our first work on the concept and developing our vision, what type of museum it will be, what its main message. In fact, immediately after the Maidan, we had very intense consultations with our American counterparts from the US. This is a hot experience. And later, Nastya said we learned the Polish experience, and now we are learning the European experience. We visited 10 museums, 2 in France, 3 in Belgium, and 4 in the Netherlands. Why this trip was vital for us, especially now, because we understand that this museum is not only for Ukrainians. Its functions are larger than we can imagine. And given the Ukrainian experience over the independence years, Ukraine hasn't built any museum, any current museum. Only the beginning, it was the National Museum of the Holocaust, Holodomor. And we don't know great national museums who could become examples and who could be able to change the society. Within this context, what we are doing now, creating concept that would be the fundamental for the architectural competition and for implementation of the museum memorial complex is extremely important to us. As ideas of Ukrainians and movements of Ukrainians are very chaotic, we see that it's not only our problem. There is a conflict between history and memory. It's a universal tradition. And politicians are maneuvering within the corridors of these conflicts. For Ukraine, it's quite hard to talk about not only history, not about the memory preservation, but how state museums should survive in this difficult situation. Yulia mentioned stakeholders. Yes, we had not a very successful experience, the competition of the dignity territories. Now we are we are switching to the next stage. Now we want to understand our educational role. Who in Ukraine decides about a cultural institution of such scale, and how we can, from which perspectives, from which point of views, we should tell people about the events the point of view of the winners, of the defeated, or maybe the other parts should be engaged, as was fairly mentioned by Robert van Voren, and about the project of the preservation of the Maidan history, and as to its museum memorial complex. He mentioned the parties engaged to this topic. It's families. It's the families who are also a part of the Maidan, and within this context, the museums we visited were very instructive to us, and we saw both good and not so good sides, and it evidences about the dynamic process of the museum development. Franklin van Paul, also one of the key persons who also initiated the project, he's not present here. We call him a museum guru of our trips. This is a person who created several museums in the Netherlands. The National Military Museum we visited. Also, he is a person who worked on concepts of other museums. And this person issues a museum journal. We want to integrate it into our information space of Ukraine. The museums were dedicated to the First World War. 100 years have passed, but we see that there are still problems. Here we can observe the conflict between the history and the contemporary, the memory of French, of British, of Dutch. And we were very interested in this situation because the museum about the World War II was not relevant, but now it is not. Now, on the contrary, we saw that the memory is quite vibrant. And as an example, the Resistance Museum is very illustrative. This is a small museum in Amsterdam. We compared it with the large museum with the National Maritime Museum in the Netherlands. They are very different museums in the investment, by the number of visitors. But these museums have plenty of visitors. They change the society and they build the future. The key role of such museums, not to fire bad situations, but to provide good decisions in such complicated situations that are related to conflicts between the history and the memory. And this Resistance Museum also confirms our ideas. We built our narratives. Every museum has personal records, and history is presented through stories of individuals. It's quite complicated, but they have to be. We have alive historical persons. The problem is how the subjects of history can be transformed into the objects of museum expositions, who will stay behind the glass. Maybe within this context, it's hard to us to make conclusions because the realization process provides for some time. And I think that we will have to have more time to generalize our experience practically, to develop the concept. But it's quite clear that the museum doesn't have to be a book. The museum doesn't have to be a library. It doesn't have to be created only by scientists. It's a dynamic process where, if we talk in the language of our counterparts, this concept is not easily perceived by the Ukrainian society. The museum is a theater, is a dynamic. It shouldn't be a Disneyland. Of course, it was interested for us how French, Belgium, and Netherlands museums combine education function and entertaining function. As Robert Franklin said, that, for example, 60% in the Netherlands don't visit museums at all. And this is a category. The museums can count on 40% for the potential audience of the museum. area of the Netherlands. 60% are included into the entertaining institutions and educational institutions. That's why planning its educational programs, the museums have to take into account 60% and to envisage forms and elements that could attract the audience. And we saw two examples when the museums combined the memorial and an interesting center of human rights, where we saw in the Holocaust Museum in Mechelen in Belgium. Kazerne de Sinvi, it's called. It's also an interesting institution whose historical territory is divided by a road. And we were told that it is very good. It was very good because there was a memorial, there was a museum. And the museum, the memorial is located at former barracks where Hato was located. And we saw the correlation between these two important units. And there is another important structural detachment. This is the human right detachment, which works with the police, with the army, who makes the problems of the past important to the modern situation. And this concept never, ever, it is considered to be a real populism, but now it becomes a part of the life. And we had an opportunity not only to look at the exposition as common tourists, but we met with the directors, with the deputy directors, with people who were directly engaged into creating museums, expositions, and educational programs. We had Franklin van der Poel, Robert van Voren, who are very well aware with the political situation, with the museum, mythological situations, and we saw things we couldn't see if we visited as common persons. And every day we made records of things we liked or disliked, and also made notes of things we wanted to implement here into our museum practice. And in conclusion, it's hard to tell everything about the impressions. We have certain positive practical findings. We have an established cooperation, and we have an interest of certain Dutch museum professionals who created the museums to take part in our team, who would deal with the scenography first of all, because I understand that the concept is only the beginning. The scenography is the continuation, how the museum area will develop, with which forms and methods. These, the architectural competition will be very important when it is announced into this chain. Scenography is not known in Ukraine. And we saw several unsuccessful examples when a building was erected specifically. A museum in Peron, when a famous architect, quite talented, built a luxurious facility that would match, that could be an artistic museum, a natural museum, but it couldn't serve as the memory museum of the First World War. It had very much light and inconvenient planning. And we saw such a conflict with other museums. And useful an example was presented by the National Military Museum that where a part of the team was engaged. And Mr. Franklin was engaged there. And he left a certain space to correct mistakes. If some things had failed, then they would have had an opportunity to open another part of the exhibition and make corrections. This experience was very incredibly useful, and I hope that the Museum of Maidan, the memorial of the Holy 100, has to be created based on open principles, and it has to have a process in which the interests of the stakeholders and the idea of professionals should be balanced, but the professionals' idea should be given the preference. Thank you. And given that we have quite little time, and we have an incredible amount of impressions. They couldn't be squeezed into an hour or even day or two. I would suggest that probably you colleagues ask some specific questions with regard to the thing that you have here, all the members of the team.
Tamara Vasilyevna Schweiz. Good afternoon. I'm a wife of Heavenly Hundred Hero. I would like to thank you, Igor. You said to me that I have a very sensitive soul, and today I want to thank you because you speak not only from your mind but also from your soul, and you felt what was going on in that countries, and I believe that events of the Revolution of Dignity, they continue, the revolution continues, and this will be in this memorial space. Another question to Nastya. You said that in autumn you will have a round table, something will be discussed about all the things that you got and about the implementation. And I am the member of the committee. To hold a contest. Our state plans to carry out a contest until 21st of November, and we will have the results of this contest. What about the timeline? What do you plan? What are the activities? Thank you for your warm words, Tamara. First, about the agenda. I believe that our results that we have now, it will be included in the project, and this will be provided to the architect that will elaborate the idea, and this is important at this stage. The contest is not announced yet. So Igor said about one of the main lessons, and we should not provide a task to architect when they were not provided by the most important sensitive issues, because there should be messages provided, and these ideas, they will be in the concept, and I believe that in autumn we expect the results of this contest, and it will include these messages. And concerning the seminar, this seminar will be a large-scale project, not only about the Museum of Maidan, and maybe this is another process independent of this contest. We have many museums in Ukraine and a lot of museum workers who cannot travel abroad and get this foreign experience for different reasons. But we got this experience and we should share, we should provide it to other specialists. That's why we want to hold the seminar. I repeat, the seminar and the results of the contest, they are not directly linked, but we will continue our work and you will see some results in several weeks. And the concept and the task, these are different things. The concept will be adopted, and only after this the task will be provided. Ideally, we should include in the contest task and they should understand the basic things, how the space of the museum be organized. So these are the issues And the preparation of the contest should be started. There is a provision of the Cabinet of Ministers on this, and this is the issue of openness of the power and the engagement of the institutions and whether they are ready for a dialogue. And we should persevere, we should make effort to promote these things. So, yes, introduce yourself first. Alexander Zinchenko. In 2015, we were in Warsaw. We had also a tour with another part of this team. And intermediary result for the concept for Maidan Museum, we believe that this should be anti-narrative museum. There should be some questions, some issues should be raised, not just answers provided. So what were the results of this trip of yours? So Olha Sala, she is a designer and she likes questions. Oh, well, we discussed whether we should ask these questions that are really difficult to answer. Speaking about the exhibition, there should be some key idea of the museum. We should create it, and all the exhibition, all the facilities, they should show the main idea, to promote the main message. And if you look at museum as a place where you may feel about, you may think about some ideas, we should not avoid difficult questions. And one of the first museums we attended, there was an exhibition, an interesting one. Nothing was, there were 3 stories that were presented simultaneously, how these events were perceived in France, in Great Britain, and in Germany. And it was an interesting way to tell the story. So they do not say that someone was more truthful, more correct in this war. So there was a story presented from 3 different perspectives. So we should think how we will do it in our museum, but it would be wrong to avoid difficult questions. So I would like to add, this trip, in my personal opinion, maybe it didn't provide new understanding, but it provided us with the idea that our museum should not provide just some information, some idea. We should create an atmosphere for thinking, and we had emotional experience in the Opposition Museum in Amsterdam. There were 4 stories of children who lived under occupation, and they lived in the different conditions. One was from a Nazi family, the next child was from a Jewish family, the third child was from the family of opposition movement participant, and 4th child was done by a position. So the people who just ignored the events. And when you come to this exposition, it is. So this is my piano. These were my friends, and the Nazi girls say. So my friends stopped to speak to me. So this exhibition, there is a video with the same people. These people are still alive, and they say about their memories. And a girl from this Nazi family, she said that after the Second World War, she was arrested. She was beaten, she wasn't provided with food, and she didn't have any friends. And she made conclusion that when everyone celebrates victory, she said, this is not my victory. I do not celebrate, but I know that I won't I will always think and I will always have my personal opinion on things. So, and there is such thing that was and people are asked at the end of exhibition, what would they do if they were in this occupation, whether they would agree with the situation, or maybe they would hide or flee. What would they do in this case? So this exhibition raises questions. It asks people difficult questions.
Very nice example. One of the museums that we visited was the Caserne Dessin, which is in structure very, identical. It's a memorial, it's a museum, and it works in the field of mental health, educational efforts. One of the exhibits is about how the police in Belgium participated in the deportation of Jews. There were very few policemen who actually resulted. The majority just went along and rounded them up and sent them off to the extermination camps. This is, by the museum, used as a basis for discussions with police officers currently working. So what would you do, right? What kind of choices do you make? Also in connection with, the xenophobic tendencies in Western Europe, with the ethnic minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So you use an example from the past in order to force people to think about the current and about the future. And I think this is a perfect example also for the Maidan Museum.
Також конфліктна історія, вона часом є не такою прямою. Зокрема, Національний військовий музей, він теж порушує проблему. Він не просто описує, які героїчні...
This is not only about the military forces of the Netherlands, but also many people they believe that army is evil, and it shows two sides of the medal. So if there are no conflicts, there won't be any armies. So the role of the army for them, for one people, the military are heroes, and for others they are not. And some exhibitions are built on this contrast. Good afternoon. Several words about policy of memory. Western museums are really interesting because there are different approaches, and there is a wish to not to present just the memory of the winners. And in Soviet museums, we had the same. The Museum of the First and the Second World War, the history was presented by the winners, and the other side was seen as enemies, as criminals, especially after the Second World War, because really Nazis, they committed a lot of crimes. And the condemnation was so high. And in the Museum of Resistance, at the end of 1980s, the girl that came from Nazi family, she was afraid to tell her personal story because of this, she could have been fired or be under some sort of oppression or discrimination. And in 50s and 1940s, some people were discriminated because of this. And in 2000, so they started to raise questions, and they tried to show the position of the other side to understand the essence of the conflict. And the conflict is always difficult to understand because there is dark side of the winners and the white side of the opponents. But another aspect is important. This is memorial. How the relatives perceive this other side. And in the memorial in the valley, there are the graves of British soldiers who defended south of France in the war, and it is interesting what is the position of the relatives. So the relatives, they have painful memories, and for us it was interesting how to create a memorial and a museum that would be interesting, that would be fair, that would provide narratives of both sides, and this is important. And there is a number of important aspects, how to present the materials, how to hold these excursions and tours, and people may hear the excursion without a guide. So a museum speaks for itself, and for this there are many technical means. And this is digitalizing of archives. A person can come to an interactive board and to see the scan of the document that is in the archive and to get information from it. And 90% of the archives, they are digitalized, and some of the materials are placed on the internet, and if you do not attend the museum, there is paid access to some materials. So also electronic documentation and other innovations that are really important now. Another important aspect, in the course of our tour, we understood that this museum should be not only about Maidan, about heroes, this should be a museum about Ukraine. We got a lot of information about expectations of our tourists, those people who want to come here, and they do not have a lot of information about Ukraine, about Ukrainian identity, and they believe that there should be more information about Ukraine, about its people, about our values, and in this context, we believe it is really important. And I would like to add about Igor's speech. During our last day, we had the meeting with the specialists of the Holland museums, and they had really limited information about Maidan and about Ukraine on the whole. And we explained to them our concepts, and we really tried to inform them about Ukraine. And I was surprised, and it impressed me when we spoke about it. One of the specialists, he drew some symbol with his pen, and he said, I feel that I want to provide some image to present it like one drop that unites the ocean. And we said that we are like a drop in the ocean. And he didn't know about our ideas, but we tried to provide, to communicate ideas properly. And a person from different culture, he was able to scan this idea. And it is a great plus, and this is the big goal for our project. So we should not only present history, but we should understand that the Maidan Museum is the museum for self-identification and self-presentation of Ukraine in the world. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I really want to visit this museum and to see what will be there, including the experience from other countries that you got from your trip. And when we worked on the concept, there were 2 museums in Berlin that you wanted to visit. Yes, we want to visit them in September. But maybe you should go there in the summer. Maybe you will lose some impressions if you go there after such a long period. So we thank all of our guests. Thank you very much. Till the next time, goodbye.